is it that wheat is bad and animal products are bad, or is it that what they're made of now has completely changed, and that's the problem? It's James here, and I'm so excited you're here for this masterclass with Zach Bush. You will be learning about the gut, which, as we're understanding more, becomes the seat of our understanding of immunity and health and overall well-being. So whether you have gut issues, bloating, gas, or an autoimmune condition, or you're simply wanting a check-in on the status of your gut health, you're not going to want to miss this masterclass. So many great takeaways, including one of my favorites around disease identities. This was something that really helped shift my father's well-being, and I'm so glad that Zach brought it up. He's one of the most preeminent experts on this topic in the world. Don't want to miss it. Plus, if you love learning about healing and taking control of your health, you're going to love our Food Matters Nutrition Certification course. In 12 weeks, you can become certified and improve your capacity to help yourself and help others. To find out more, there will be a link below this video. Now strap in, get ready, put your phone on Do Not Disturb, get a notebook ready, and a pen and paper, and some water. This is a doozy. Enjoy this masterclass, and I'll see you at the end. Hey, Zach, how you doing? Great to have you here.
Really a pleasure to be with you, James. Looking forward to being with you in the audience.
Yeah, so to kick straight off, I think, gut health has had what I would say is an enormous rise to prominence over the past 5 to 10 years, from, relatively unknown to everyone's obsessed with, probiotics and looking after the gut health and bloating and gas and indigestion. There's so much more discussions. Why do you think it's so important now more than ever before? And how do you think it's gotten this new sort of PR lift in a way?
The biology of the gut hasn't changed in billions of years, probably, of life within the cosmos, and that the gut is the foundation by which any life form comes forward. So if we look at soil systems, the soil's the gut system of a plant that's growing there, and the plant grows its intestinal lining external to its organism so that it can absorb nutrients from outside of it. The fungi are the first version of that. So the fungi recognize the opportunity to, instead of try to have a stomach or an internal digestive system similar to a bacteria, so bacteria will absorb nutrients and have to digest them internally, the fungi outsource that to the soil and realize that they could do far more energetic work by excreting digestive enzymes outside of the fungal network, outside of the mycelial web, and let the soil system digest all of its nutrients and then absorb it after digestion. And so the human does something similar in that we've created a body that doesn't take in the nutrients into every single cell and try to deal with it on that level. And so we outsource it to the soil. And so we have developed a body that has this tube that we call a gut that is actually external to the human body. And so your mouth to your rectum is an external environment to the human body. And the human body actually begins at the gut lining, and everything deep to the gut lining is you, and everything within the gut, the stewing environment of your stomach, the small intestines, all the digestive enzymes there, all the way through the nutrient and water absorption process of the colon. All of that stuff inside the gut is external to the human body. So we learned from the fungi, and maybe you've heard that we're more similar to a mushroom or a fungal system than we are to many animals. And there's some truth in that because of the way in which we've outsourced the intelligence of a diverse ecosystem or soil system to do a lot of our work for us. And so we have not changed that matrix in the last 5 years. It's just as important now as it was then. What happened is humans lost their gut health, and
Yeah.
we'll actually never really give anything appreciation until we've lost it, right? You don't know how good life is until you lose that one thing that you were taking for granted. And in this case, it was the gut.
Yeah, that's so true. Humans are a funny species to not value something until it's lost. I mean, there's this saying, if you have your health, you have 1,000 goals, and if you don't have your health, you have one goal, right? Which is to get your health back. Speaking to this idea of our insides not being us, Daniel Vitalis, who's a great nature-based philosopher, I revere his work. He's like a host of Wild Fed now, a show on Nat Geo. He told me once that we're a little bit like a donut,
Mhm.
and our mouth to our rectum is the inside of the donut, except we're just sort of stretched out, you know, and we allow things into our bodies through the way that our skin, both inside our digestive tract and outside on our body, interacts with the world, you know. And I think that it's uh it's almost like sad the way that we treat it, you know. We're really not that in touch with it. Probably the first question I would have to follow on from this is, how do people know if their gut health is out of balance? Like you said, people don't realize that something is important until they lose it. What's the sort of first telltale signs of people having an issue with their whole digestive system, and what's like end stage issues?
Yeah, interestingly, the beginning is symptoms that we wouldn't necessarily attribute to the gut, and so the end stage is the bloating and the digestive issues, and you have chronic constipation, chronic diarrhea, these kinds of syndromes, inflammatory bowel disease, where you got autoimmune conditions that can be anything from celiac to celiac disease being the gluten, trigger, all the way to things like Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. So that's kind of the long way down the pathway of a destroyed gut system. Way upstream, the symptoms tend to be neurologic, and we now know that the gut has more neural endings than any other organ system within the entire body. There's actually more neurons in the gut than there are in the brain of a dog, and so you've perhaps heard that the gut is the second brain. But ultimately, the way in which we're starting to understand it is we get better and better at microscopic imaging of the gut lining in the in vivo state. In a living gut, we're starting to be able to image the neural system, starting to realize that the gut's the first brain, and the thing that we tend to think of as the human brain up top in your head is actually the CPU chip. And so the central processing unit in your computer is a vital piece of the computer, in that it accelerates the amount of information you can process, but it doesn't create the information. The laptop that I'm sitting in front of right now has a keyboard on it, which is what would eventually get information to that CPU chip, so that it can start to make patterns and do some pattern recognition. Or I can give my computer instructions for that CPU chip to receive a bunch of data from a hard drive or from the internet. And so we're uploading data up into the CPU chip of the computer, and the better that CPU chip, the faster the computer, the more I can do. But it's the same thing I can do. So interestingly, the slow computers that I grew up with in the 1980s could do the same thing, just way slower, right? And so the brain is similar to that. The CPU chip up here is an extremely fast processing unit, but it isn't the thing that creates intelligence. It can maybe do work faster, but the human brain isn't more intelligent than a dolphin or a monkey or whatever you're thinking of as kind of our competitors out there in the intelligence game. What's happened is we are playing with better data sets. And when I say a better data set to create intelligence, or the appearance of a superior intelligence, data sets improve as they get more diverse inputs. And so the more species that are inputting data to your single CPU chip, the more intelligence you tend to be able to exhibit, because the CPU chip is getting more rich and diverse perspectives on the reality that you're living in. And we now know that the human colon is the most complex, most eco-diverse, most biodiverse system on the planet, more so than coral reefs, more so than rainforests, more so than any other large intestine of any other mammal. The human colon, through some massively beautiful process of perfecting an anatomical organ system, has developed so many niche micro ecosystems within it that it can harbor more biodiversity per cubic centimeter than any place else on Earth. And for this, the first brain is able to get so much data from so many diverse perspectives, and this is what creates intelligence. And so the CPU chip of your human brain is processing data quickly, but the intelligence is actually coming from the gut itself. It's coming from that soil system within you. A healthy human gut, 40,000 species of bacteria, with probably 500,000 species of fungi and yeast and protozoa and a bunch of other stuff in the mix. Whereas in an American gut, or somebody living in kind of your average industrialized food system, walking around with 10,000 species of bacteria. So
Wow.
you've lost 75% of your workforce. And therefore, you're starting to detect some of these issues where the first brain isn't getting the information it used to get. And so the neurologic symptoms that are early on in a failure of gut health tend to be difficulty concentrating, poor short-term to long-term memory consolidation, poor creativity. You kind of lose that creative streak. You start to get into that depressive mode where nothing seems to stimulate the juices like they did before. And so you start to collapse in that creative stream. Maybe start to pick up your arts and crafts a little less. You're not playing your guitar quite as much. And so you're seeing this literal kind of dumbing down of the human expression and creativity from this loss of the biodiverse inputs that were giving you the creative input to begin with. And so those initial things are just like that slight failure to thrive state of just monotony where you get into a groove. And then as that starts to deteriorate further, then you get into migraine headaches, vascular headaches, cluster headaches, poor sleep quality, poor sex drive, uh, and then dropping down into the inflammatory cascade, inflammation of the joints, inflammation of organ systems, for the male, middle age, the common one is prostate symptoms, so urinary frequency, you can't empty the bladder as much. So these things don't seem to be oriented to the gut or resulting from, but this is the upstream stuff when that workforce starts to fail. It's these subtle neurologic shifts that are really the beginning of it.
Yeah, super interesting, Zach. And early on in my food journey, which has spanned, nearly 2 decades now, and, began with, sort of more hardcore, like raw food and connecting back into nature and just basically saying no to anything processed, right? That was the beginning. And then over time, there's different learning points and different data sets that you get access to, both from a feeling perspective and from a knowledge perspective, and it shifts. But early on, one of the experiments that I did is after I really cleansed my body out, I could tell that when I ate something that wasn't resonant with my being, the first thing I noticed was a suppression in my mental health. And it's funny that you say that. It really connects to me. So, um, in Australia, which is my home nation originally, and in Britain, there's a famous food group called, fish and chips, which is pretty abhorrent, really, the modern version of it, right? So it's basically fish, which is not necessarily bad, but then they batter it with, non-organic flour, and then they deep fry it in vegetable oils. So this is the antithesis of a health food, right? And then I noticed that it was that particular food, if I ever ate it, and this was quite a while ago, it's definitely not on my menu at the moment. The next day, I would notice a suppression in my mental aptitude, a slight depressive feeling, and just overall like a reduction in my humanness, right? And it was a very clear correlation. And I feel like many people maybe don't allow their body to speak to them. They it's like the light on the car, and it's if it's on all the time, you sort of ignore it. But if you're a clean eater and you try this and you notice it immediately. But if you're eating like this all the time, I mean, it's like, well, that's how I am. I'm just sort of a little flat, a little depressed, a little off, a little tired. And for you to sort of reiterate that the first symptoms are neurological really resonates with my experience personally in testing these different food groups in my body. I mean, it's big.
Yeah, and it's exciting in that the solution is so simple, right?
Mm.
And that the beginning of that journey is just stop doing so much damage, right? So
Yeah.
it's not
Yeah.
like you got to go crack the code on the universe here to figure out gut health. And so fortunately, the journey into health can start pretty quite simply of like, well, if I just eliminate the top five noxious things I'm putting in my body, that'd probably help out. And the fact is, it does help and starts
Yeah.
moving the needle. But what you just described, I think there's another way of looking at this to the biology, which is a hangover. And so you described, the day after, I suddenly
Mm.
felt this drop and,
Mm.
woke up groggy, feeling flat, a little depressive, not feeling like going to work. You can think of a typical hangover being attributed to alcohol, but the phenomenon is actually almost identical. So alcohol is one of the first compounds that normalized in the human diet that breaks the gut lining's tight junctions. And so the Velcro that holds billions of gut cells together, a single gut cell is about half the circumference or half the diameter, if you will, of a human hair.
Hmm.
And so that gives you a sense of just how tiny a gut cell is. And so you've
Yeah.
got billions of these cells that create the largest surface area of the human body. So larger than a tennis court in surface area is your gut lining, made up of billions and billions and billions of these microscopic cells that are held together by these Velcro-like proteins called tight junctions. And alcohol dissolves those tight junctions, gives you this leaky gut phenomenon for a few hours. Your body will, kind of recover that over the next few hours. But the next morning you're dehydrated. You didn't do a good job absorbing water from the gut because it was leaking. Water would try to get into your body, but it would come, leak right back out into the gut and pass with the stool. You got chemicals and compounds that weren't supposed to be in the body leaking into the body, and so that therefore
Mm.
your immune system's activated after the day after excess alcohol. And so you could kind of go down the list, and it turns out that's what our modern food is doing. Is this? It's now using herbicides rather than alcohol to break those
Yeah.
type of junctions. And so the hangover we now have from a modern, typical processed food industry is a literal hangover the next day.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
we're having that phenomenon on top of the drug hangover. And what I mean by a drug hangover is that the fat, salt, sugar combinations that you would have in the fish and chips meal, for
Mm.
example. And so the fat, salt, sugar would be something like the battered, oils with the salt that's poured into that on the fries and the fish, and then the beer or the soda or
Yeah.
carbohydrates sort of sitting next to that would be very typical. And so that fat, salt, sugar combination induces the brain to have a cocaine response. And so the
Mm.
frontal lobes, after a happy meal for a child going to McDonald's, looks just like you had just given that kid a hit of cocaine.
Mm.
And so that cocaine, massive burst in the frontal lobes of the human feels phenomenal in that first few minutes when you get that fat, salt, sugar. You're like, oh my gosh, I feel so much better after my stressful day. I'm nailing it now. I'm on target. Feels great. And you get into your groove, and then a couple hours later, if you're not continuing to stimulate yourself with another fat, salt, sugar thing, it starts to wane quickly. And then the next day, you're having that withdrawal from the drug stimulus to your frontal lobes. And so all the receptors for cocaine or for the fish and chips have down regulated. And now it's much harder to stimulate your pleasure pathways the next day because of the overwhelmed stimulus that it got the day before from the fat, salt, sugar combination or your cocaine. And so this is where addiction happens as well. Now it takes a whole lot of stimulus to get a brain that's down-regulated its pleasure centers
Mm.
to do something that feels good again. So now the next night you go, or a week later, you're back at the same restaurant, and you're going to eat more. You're going to stimulate more to get that pleasure cascade going to get the same effect that you did before. And this is the classic alcoholic. You got to drink a whole lot of alcohol to get any kind of good
Mm.
buzz if your body is normalized to this low stimulated state, this low pleasure kind of experience. And so we're addicted to the drug side, and we're suffering the consequences of the hangover of a leaky gut when we face a typical herbicide, pesticide, processed meal.
Yeah. It's sometimes you think about it and you're like, did the food companies orchestrate this? There's sometimes you feel like, is there an ulterior motive here? Or also, we're pretty simple organisms. I feel like, we had a headache. Well, instead of doing breath work and drinking more water and going for a walk, we want a pill, right? And so the pharmaceutical company said, okay, sure, here you go. And so then the next thing you know, we have cars, and I don't want to get out of my car to get food. So then, you have a drive through. So I don't know that it's in like, I think it's just like the self perpetuated desire for more and more comfort, which is slowly killing us. And there's people like, mutual friends of ours, I'm sure, like Wim Hof, et cetera, that are like, no, it's important to not be comfortable. It's actually one of the most important tenets of being human. And I find in my life, if I have too much comfort, I'll blow it up every 5 years or so. It's like, no, there's something in me that's like, oh, it's just not right. I have a reasonably philosophical question which I've grappled with for a number of years. I saw actually, which is an interesting full circle moment, John Robbins speak at a longevity conference with David Wolf maybe about 8 years ago. And John wrote Diet for New America, and I've been very humbled to produce his movie of his life story, Love Over Money, and get to know him in a much deeper way, and just an incredible gentleman. And his sort of first book, Diet for New America, was really, tearing shreds on industrial meat production in the US and sort of promoting more of a vegetarian way of living. And, in the, 2008, 2012, 2014, a lot of movement around that. And it's a very righteous idea. But at that talk, he first started to hint on this idea that it was the type of meat that had changed, which could have been having the deleterious health impacts more than just the meat consumption itself. And it got me thinking, because we, of course, increased our meat consumption in a modern, developed Western world, but at the same time that we produced more low quality animal products by factory farming and feeding them corn, wheat, and soy, foods that were never meant designed to eat. And it makes me think about wheat as well, that, we vilified wheat in the gut healing spaces. It's like, yeah, well, gluten free is a great thing to do. And if you stop eating gluten and you have gut issues, you'll notice like, wow, I'm feeling better. My mental health is sort of coming back. My digestive symptoms are normalizing. But I think we've made wheat the problem, which is fair enough. We've changed wheat a lot. But is it the wheat or is it the glyphosate? And this is where I'm sort of getting to it. Is it the animal products or is it that we're feeding them corn, wheat, and soy, which is sprayed with these toxins? And so what is it, Zach? Is it that wheat is bad and animal products are bad, or is it that what they're made of now has completely changed and that's the problem?
It's the latter for sure. We've been eating diverse diets all over the world for our entire 300,000 year history of Homo sapiens sapiens, and for 1.2 million years as hominids. And so, from Neanderthals to us, we've been eating extremely high protein diets with an enormous amount of animal protein some parts of the year, because there went the zebra across the plains, and so we were quick to capture that food energy. Then winter shifted, the herds moved on, we nut collected, and acorns were a major staple for much of North America, and many of the earliest signs of hunter-gathering were the acorn. And so we had tree nuts as a major staple of protein. And we would binge on those. And interestingly, the American Gut Project has been looking at this phenomenon in African tribes that are still living in their indigenous environments and hunting and gathering, and that the tribes are showing us what the ideal gut looks like. 40,000 species that I mentioned earlier was from that American Gut Project that was studying the Hadza tribe of western and kind of mid portions of the African continent there. And so they've shown us how much potential the human gut has when you're in a natural cycling, pattern. And interestingly, the gut microbiome in them did not change from day to day or week to week, depending on what they were eating. The diversity was really the result we found from their immediate, direct, intimate contact with the ecosystem around them.
Wow.
So the ecosystem was constantly reinforcing biodiversity in them because they were laying on the ground, sitting by the fire at night, telling story, breathing fresh air every day, never went into a plastic off-gassing car or office or anything. And so their ecosystem touch was so intimate that it was the one that was reinforcing this 40,000 species, not their food. And so the fact that we look to like a probiotic to give us 3 species of bacteria is kind of ludicrous. It's showing us that our version of gut health is like the most reductionist, dumbed down version of this if we're going to go to a probiotic. What we really want to be doing is getting intimate with our environment again to get this 40,000 species. But to answer your question around, is food bad for the gut, any kind of food? The answer seems to be no from the Hadza. A good example is this is during one of the portions of the study, and they were taking stool samples every single day for 15 years from these tribes, and so they were studying them through seasonal changes and through food changes. And a good example was one of the tribes located a massive honeycomb that had been built into this huge dead tree. For a solid 10 days, the tribe only ate honey, not even of this. And to the shock of the investigators, eating pure carbohydrate without a shred of, all the other things we think of, starches, proteins,
Fiber.
there was just absolutely no change in this ecosystem of the gut. And so that was really this compelling thing, that if you do see major changes in your gut from intake of a major change in your diet, then it means you're probably not tied into the natural support system for a healthy gut. And it's the fragility of your gut that's making the food have such a large impact on your sense of wellness, your sense of nutrient density, nutrition, etc. And so that study has been really exciting because it's showing us that it's being at one with nature is the beginning of a healthy gut. And if you are at one with nature, you're pretty much bulletproof to the degree that they were able to show this extraordinary moment, which was terrifying to the study group, and that was coming from 6 different universities around the world. And they knew they were studying like the last healthy guts on the planet. And this missionary group came through and left boxes and boxes of antibiotics for this tribe and said, if you ever get sick, just take 3 of these a day and you'll be fine. Just like, I'm
No.
sure very much feeling good about themselves and altruistic in their goals.
Hmm.
But the study team was under strict rules from the study structure that they weren't able to intervene with any decisions or pathway that the tribes were picking. So they couldn't change their behavior in any way, including negative potential insults. So they couldn't stop these guys. And the Hadza sat around that night talking about these boxes of things, and it looked a heck of a lot like candy. And so they started popping these things. By the next morning, the tribe had eaten
No,
boxes
no.
and boxes of antibiotics. And the study team literally was just devastated. Like, this could be the end of human gut health. We may have just destroyed or been witness to the destruction of the last healthy guts on Earth. They kept their religious, practice of the stool collections all this next month, and it would take them about 60 days to get the data back. So they'd have to send the stool samples back to the States and do this processing and the DNA analysis. They got the data back 60 days later, and there had not been a single drop in microbiome diversity in these guts with boxes of antibiotics in a single night. And so what the hot start are training us in is the gut is literally bulletproof because it is not an isolated system in a natural setting of a culture. In a modern culture where we have executed our relationship with nature and we
Yeah,
have made ourselves in opposition to it in that pursuit of comfort you were talking about,
yeah,
now we suddenly become a very vulnerable closed loop system where we don't get this reinforcement minute by minute from the microbiome. But if you think of the Hadza, there's no wonder they didn't have a drop in their gut microbiome, because their gut microbiome actually is the entire ecosystem in which they're living. Their gut is
mm,
continuous with the soil they're sitting on. And
mm,
we've been able to show that if you start to garden, for example, and you start pulling weeds, just the microbiome on your hands that you're getting reintroduced to is going to actually end up as contributing a significant portion of your biodiversity within your gut within hours, but
mm.
certainly days of contact. So no wonder the antibiotic didn't have effect, because you're treating a tiny little piece of the African bush with this antibiotic. In contrast, the American is isolated from their greater soil system. They don't sit on the ground. They don't touch the soil. They don't touch the plants. They certainly don't touch the animals that they're about to eat.
Mm.
So we're so divorced from the origin of the microbiome and its relationship to our macronutrient system. But at the same time, in contrast to the Hadza that are living in untouched African bush, we are living in an environment that is buried in antibiotics from herbicides and
Yeah,
pesticides. In the United States, 85% of our rainfall and 85% of the air we breathe is contaminated with glyphosate, which is the most
mm,
active and concerning herbicide on the planet. It's the most abundant herbicide on the planet. We spray about 4 billion pounds a year into the soil, water, and air systems of the earth. It's a water soluble toxin, so as soon as it goes and hits the farm soil, it's going to be run off into the streams and then evaporating into the air,
mm,
consolidating in the clouds, raining back down. So the entire hydrologic surface, from surface to sky, is contaminated. And now we've demonstrated in our deepest aquifers in the United States, for example, but also now in South America, all over the world, we've contaminated these deep fossil aquifers with glyphosate. And so
mm.
it will be hundreds, if not thousands of years before the hydrologic cycle of humanity starts to free itself up from this antibiotic that we call glyphosate. And so it's a potent antibiotic in soil. And unfortunately, because it's water soluble, it gets into the food itself. And so
Mm.
the canola you mentioned, the seed oils that we're cooking all our food in, those oils are relatively low because it's an oil-based system. But unfortunately, the water elements within those food systems are going to have extremely high residues of the glyphosate. And this ends up doing damage inside the meat. And so the cells inside the meat are all carrying glyphosate. And so your
Mm.
animal's eating GMO corn, soybean that are genetically modified plants that are able to handle very high levels of glyphosate spraying. And then you end up with these residues. The meat's going to have high residues. Your root vegetables are going to have high residues, and ultimately your wheat is going to have high residues because, especially in northern climates, where you have a short growing season, you're going to be seeing a lot of glyphosate used at the end of the growing season for wheat to dry it quickly. And so it's not used as a weed killer; it's used as a drying agent to speed the harvest of the wheat. And so our very first peer-reviewed science that we published out of my laboratory about 12 years ago or something was demonstrating that there is not gluten sensitivity, there's only glyphosate sensitivity. And we showed the exact mechanism by which glyphosate turns on this gluten damage. And so if you just eat gluten, high levels of it, you might get a 15 or 20% decrease in your protective shield of your gut lining. It's minor, your immune system deals with it. If you put a tiny bit of glyphosate in there, parts per billion of glyphosate, which is much less than would be sprayed on a typical wheat field, but even tiny amounts of that glyphosate plus the gluten, you lose 85 to 90% of your shield. And so it was the addition of this glyphosate chemical in 1991 to the wheat industry that led to this 1992, 93, 94 explosion of gluten sensitivity, celiac, and the rest. And so you can map it acre by acre, acres sprayed with desiccant and acres of wheat sprayed with desiccant glyphosate, and the occurrence in that population of gluten sensitivity. So it is truly not a gluten sensitivity, it's truly a glyphosate sensitivity. And for that, you're going to benefit from stopping gluten because in the United States, you're going to immediately stop eating you're going to start eating less glyphosate. And so you're going to attribute your improvement to the gluten just as much as you did the disease. And both are untrue. The gluten is not keeping you from being healthy. It's really the glyphosate that is carrying. And my patients got to experience this all the time, right? So I'd have severe gluten sensitivity people. And if you read the top 5 symptoms of gluten sensitivity, again, it's not the gut. Number 5 is like bloating and all that. 1, 2, 3, 4 is fatigue, loss of sex drive, loss of creativity, everything we talked about earlier. And so gluten sensitivity is really this phenomenon of glyphosate poisoning that's dropping the microbial density in your gut from this herbicide or antibiotic effect, coupled with the direct effect of it, which is leaky gut. We've demonstrated in our lab. We're the first lab to really detail out in great detail how glyphosate damages human cells directly through suppressing all kinds of things, including mitochondrial metabolism and therefore the obesity epidemic, including the immune system's response to self molecules, therefore autoimmune diseases, the damage to your reproductive tract. That's the collapse of testosterone in males these days, and this collapse of progesterone, estrogen in females, and therefore the infertility. And then you do that in the womb, and you end up degenerating a fetus that's growing in that environment. So everything that we've seen over the last 50 years in this chronic disease epidemic literally can be mapped back to a single molecule, glyphosate.
Jeez. So I think, the whole gluten sensitivity thing needs a rebrand, right? Like as in glyphosate sensitivity and calling it what it is, because that's a huge disservice we're doing to people by not knowing that that's the root cause of it. There's a lady I started following on Instagram that sort of started this whole movement of being like, I thought I was sensitive to gluten, but it was the glyphosate. Now she's all into like organic baking, using biodynamic heirloom organic wheat, and like she's thriving. And it was like, it's such a another great data point for me to go, yeah, it's not the wheat. We love to vilify things and then build industries around it, like gluten-free, all this sort of stuff, which is great, but it's
I have
not
a funny
solving the
story about
problem.
that. So we got this data, we published this paper, peer-reviewed science, proved that we could actually reverse gluten sensitivity by the supplements we were making, which are these fossil soil compounds. So we were so excited. We were just like, oh my gosh, we're going to reverse this whole syndrome. This was like 2012. So by this time, like 1 in 4 Americans was identifying as gluten sensitive, and it was full out epidemic going on. So we booked. I had no money at all. I had started my lab on $10,000, and so we were totally broke. But we had these bottles of supplements that we'd made, and taken us quite a while to get this whole system up. And so I load up my little Mazda to drive to Ohio to the National Gluten Sensitivity and gluten-free product to debut. I think it was like $500 to get a booth at this place, and so have my Mazda like loaded with all of these banners that I had like my wife like hand draw things, and we had no money, so it was just like so funky. And we get there, but we've got all these beautiful science images of the gut lining before and after gluten and glyphosate and the whole thing. And I set up, and I'm so excited, and I'm 2 hours into like telling passionately every single person walking by the booth, we can reverse your gluten sensitivity. Let me show you how this works. Blah blah blah. 2 hours into a 3-day event, this woman comes up. I'm the head of this thing. What do you have here? I just heard rumbles that you're telling people you can reverse gluten sensitivity. I was like, you can. Let me show you. And I'm just like, just bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. And she's like, you've got to take down your booth and leave. And I was like, wait, what? Sure enough, within 4 hours of the thing starting, we were kicked out of the entire thing because every other booth was selling a gluten-free product of something or other. And so
Oh,
that was my understanding all of a sudden, that the same mindset that had gotten me pretty much kicked out of academia for creating chemotherapy from nutrition.
yeah.
It was like, wait a second, the gluten-free community is protecting the marketplace of gluten-free foods just as aggressively as the pharmaceutical industry is protecting cancer. Like I just couldn't believe it. And so at that point, I went through about a year of kind of giving up on humanity, and then we finally
Yeah.
got back in gear and launched the products in 2014, and it's gone well. But it is just ironic that we're
Mm.
afraid of solutions that take away our identity. And it's
Yeah.
scary how in the West we have so taken on the identity of our diseases. And so that's a
Mm.
bit of a major warning to us is, you know what, if you believe you're diabetic and somebody comes along and says, you actually don't need to be diabetic, I can fix that for you, then who are you tomorrow? Because your whole family knew you as diabetic. All of your food decisions were being made around diabetic. The excuse as to why you were overweight and not feeling well, and you had this beautiful excuse to everything you were feeling. It was like, I'm diabetic, therefore XYZ. And so we love an excuse as to why we feel bad because it kind of leaves us it eliminates the sense of responsibility to be healthy, and something else has taken over as our identity, and now we have a good excuse as to why we're not. And so it's a bit of a warning because I hear this every day in
Yeah.
the wealthiest groups in the world. You go to New York and everybody's bragging about how many antidepressants they're on and how
Mm.
depressive they are and how gluten sensitive they are. And like their list of diseases is literally what they're chatting about over lunch in a big New York fancy restaurant. And you start to realize, wow, this social norm of normalizing but identifying with our diseases is somehow so reassuring to us that it becomes socially acceptable and almost a social brand itself of, well, I've got two therapists and my therapist on the upside of New York there, and I go up there and she's so hard to book, you can never get in with that therapist. It's like the disease is your identity. The fact that you're on all these fancy treatments is your status symbol. And so we've just done this huge reversal in Western culture where we actually are desiring a diagnosis that frees us up to then pursue those easy solutions you were talking about. Get the next pill. That pill doesn't
Yep.
work. You better be on these 3 pills. Well, those 3 pills are giving you side effects. Here's 2 more pills to treat the side effects of those 3 pills. That's the game we're in.
And it's not an infinite game. That game has an end, and it's not a pretty end. And I've fortunately saved people from that game, my father included. I mean, he was on 6 meds at one point in time, and he very much identified with his condition because he was told he had this condition from the high priests of modern medicine.
Yeah.
This is what you have. And then it became hard for him to get well because every time people would see him in his home environment, they'll be like, "Oh, how are you? Are you still sick?" And it starts to whole reinforce it. And then you have insurance companies that, like, if you're sick, you get paid out, so you have to be sick. And then you're like, all of a sudden, you're trapped, right? And he had to move countries, so he moved to Fiji, and he was still on all these medications. It was very like severe chronic fatigue syndrome, pain, anxiety, depression on 6 different medications, basically mostly bedridden. And I'd started studying about nutrition and learning about orthomolecular medicine, through, Linus Pauling's work and newer incarnations of experts that had focused on high dose nutrient therapy and using the currency of the body and all this, which was something interesting. And then I'd come to him saying, Dad, guess what? I've got this answer. And he's like, you're not a doctor. I'm like, oh no. So then that became the reason I made Food Matters. Well, if I interview David Wolf or all these great experts and take him some knowledge from these experts, he'll believe them. And thankfully, that was something that cracked him open, right? And then he started to believe maybe I can heal myself, which was the biggest shift. And I think we have infinite healing potential, but if we're attached to our identity of disease, it immediately limits it. There's no opening there for that, and
Yeah.
that's
That was my conclusion after 17 years in academia and then another 10 years of practice outside in this kind of holistic alternative environment. Realized that was the beginning of every healing journey. And so I closed my clinic in favor of starting this program called Journey of Intrinsic Health, the
mm,
understanding that there's nothing outside your body. There's no IV drip from your functional medicine doctor. There's no
mm,
pharmaceutical pill. There's literally nothing that exists outside your body that's going to heal you, with the exception of that soil that might be outside your body in that hole of the donut. And so
yeah,
health is intrinsic to you, but you're going to have to find that identity in which health was originated. And so
mm,
to get there, our whole first week of the 8-week program of Journey of Intrinsic Health is dedicated to shedding the many, many identities that we take on so that you simply start to feel what it feels like to be you.
mm,
There's a lot of beautiful results of that happen in that first week. But one of the really interesting and I think maybe most important aspects of this, well, I'll give it two. But one is the intuition comes back. And
mm,
that's what your dad started to get, is like he started to get that intuition of like, you know what, actually, I think I can make a difference here. And so
yeah,
that little bit of empowerment starts to create that slippery slope of, I think I can create my destiny here. Like I can do this and I feel better the next day. I wonder if I did that. So you get this
mm,
intuition kicking in that then leads to curiosity. And so those are the two traits that when I see those coming back on, now I'm confident that that person can tap into that infinite healing potential. But if you start with, well, here's an anti-inflammatory and it's super healthy, it's curcumin and it's this and that, and it's adaptogen, it's mushroom, but you haven't addressed their self-identity issues, you can't move the needle because they are reinforcing at this deep subconscious level that they are a disease and their disease is them. And so it's a very critical piece of the puzzle that you're uncovering for your dad there is
mm.
it needs to begin small, but then empowered, and then let them snowball that thing forward into a new identity that is disease free. And that's a beautiful thing to. I mean, that's a legacy few children will ever succeed in because
Yeah.
our
I was
parents'
very,
ability to change our behavior is zero, and that goes the other way typically. So it's a challenge.
yeah, I was very fortunate to get through to him. It took a number of years of work, and once I
Maybe
did,
it was
yeah,
both.
I created a raving fan, which is great. I mean, but also my dad completely shifted, like energetically too, as a human. And as he started creating new inputs for his body, from a food perspective, we went from handshakes to hugs. It was a huge transition. And very grateful. Now it's like those awkward long hugs, and like, it's like it's beautiful, but like, that's why I say eating healthy foods has side effects too.
I've toured Australia quite a few times doing speaking tours down there, and Australians do not warm to long hugs easily. So you've done
Yeah,
something fantastic.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Something that
It
doesn't
was,
come easy, a long hug in Australia.
yeah, it was a breakthrough. It's typically a Southern Californian thing, right? Like
Yeah,
the long
exactly.
hugs, yeah.
Yeah, the only place that's more awkward to the long hug is maybe London.
There we go. Yeah, yeah, that's like the hard pat on the back,
Yeah.
that one. Yeah. Yeah. So, I was fortunate enough to spend the best part of 5 years living mostly with indigenous people in a very remote Pacific island nation called Vanuatu, and even traveling to remote outer islands there as well. At one time, during COVID, I went to an island where I arrived unannounced on a boat, after two flights and a long boat ride, to an island that hadn't had a white visitor for over 2.5, 3 years, and there was many children that had never seen an outsider. And I arrived at sunset with no plans and just spoke to them and got slept on someone's mud floor in a kitchen. And the way that they live with the ecosystem, they're just always dirty in a
Yeah.
way. They're always barefoot. They're making kava, which is a natural brew. They're out in the forest hunting like nuts and seeds and small birds and everything. And you walk through the forest, and it's like Avatar, this island, and you just walk through and then you'll see someone, in the distance, and they walk past you and there's no words exchanged. They just take something off their back, give you some of their things, and you give them some of your things, and then you keep walking. And it's like a little bit of sugar cane, or it's a little bit of a wild nut or a seed or something. It's an exchange. But ultimately, they're just with nature, right? Every part of their body is covered in nature. And they're just, your hands are always dirty. There's no getting them clean. Your feet are always dirty. And then in the West, you go into a bathroom and you hear this like psh, spray on the wall. You're like, whoa, what is that? And then there's like the hand sanitizer, which has gone ballistic in terms of popularity since COVID, right? And we're wearing shoes. We're clean every second of the day, right? And we lather ourselves in these like sulfate, like laden, SLS, like, that strip our like acid mantle off our skin. Like, and then you're telling me that it's like, it's not, it's the food, but it's the glyphosate, but it's not really the food, it's the environment we're in.
Yeah.
So what is it that people can do to start to sort of recreate that? Like, obviously they're not going to be like an indigenous Ni Vanuatu person on a remote island. And we're changing. How can somebody in the modern world start to interact more with the natural world to sort of rebuild their strength and develop more intestinal fortitude in a way?
Yeah. I mean, these are very simple technologies. Nakedness is one of them. And it's literally not just the sterile separation that creates, but literally clothes on our back is the beginning of not just our separation from the dirt you're talking about, it's the separation from the sun. And so when you start to drop both sun exposure and the microbiome, you've lost life force immediately. And so our clothing is such an interesting thing. And we've seen this with the Hadza for sure. Like when they start to adopt Western clothing, their microbiome can be seen to decrease as well. And I think that's twofold. One, you're blocking your direct contact, but two, you're also starting to poison the bloodstream with these microplastics. And so the amount of plastic that's in a typical garment will end up in the bloodstream quite readily. They pass through the skin surface quite readily. We inhale them. You run your hand over your shirt and then you eat something, you're eating the microplastics. So we are consuming a very high amount of these compounds that disrupt the endocrine system, which then in turn regulates, again, the microbiome and its diversity. We've been able to show that high stress states of the psychosocial stress, you're stressed out at your job, your financial stress, kids sick, this has an immediate negative effect on your microbiome. And so the biodiversity within your gut drops when you are stressed, which is interesting because we actually do this at the macro level. If you've got a friend that's just super depressive and a little bit psychotic because of their depression, and you just don't want to hang out with them. You're just like, maybe I'll call or maybe I'll text because even the call is too depressing. I'm sure I didn't go over and hang out all night on a Friday night because they're in the dumps. The microbiome is doing this to us. If you are the stressed out thing, they're like, well, Zach was kind of good for a while, but honestly, I'm tired of dealing with the amount of cortisol that's being secreted from his gut lining. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to go there this week. I think I'm going to party elsewhere. It's the microbiome retracts away from these chronic stress states. And it does so immediately within minutes of that big cortisol surge of getting home and stressed out. You yell at your kids and the thing. That's having an immediate effect where nature is starting to pull back from your state of stress and it snowballs on you. So nature pulls back and now you have less coping mechanisms. You got less anti-inflammatories. Your gut lining is more vulnerable to leaky gut. And so it can snowball on you very quickly. And so all of this chronic fatigue, chronic pain syndromes that we now see so ramped up in our Western societies and industrialized nations, that's the downstream of this snowballing effect of you destroying nature pulling back from that stress, and you're starting to get this isolation. And at the cellular level, once you reach isolation, you become a cancer cell. And so any cell in the body that clips enough of those tight junctions and becomes isolated will become a cancer cell. And so this whole question is maybe glyphosate is a carcinogen. No, glyphosate is absolutely a carcinogen because it creates loneliness at the cell level. Unfortunately, that's not the traditional way in which our regulatory groups consider a carcinogen. That's why there's been so much bickering and why glyphosate continues to get approved, is because they're relying on an old definition of a carcinogen that's 50 years old that says that it
Yeah.
has to directly damage DNA to be a carcinogen.
Jeez.
That's not our understanding for 50 years of science, but that's where the regulators have been empowered to know this. And most regulators are not scientists.
Mm.
They're taught how to keep a bureaucratic, track of what's going on, but they're not keeping up with, they're not running laboratories and keeping up with it. They probably learned their biology 10, 15, 30 years ago. And so there's this paucity of new information there at the regulatory level that keeps us rubber stamping really bad decisions for the food system. So it's not like there's a cabal sitting there doing this. This is just bad information,
Yeah.
poor education, not the right information in the right place. And so I really believe that there's just an opportunity for us to bring the information to the right place. An example of this was that the U.S. Senate sat down with 6 senators, two of which are really critical to our agricultural system. One sits as the chair of the ag committee that basically is responsible for, among many other things, passing and writing the farm bill that allocates over the last 10 years almost $1 trillion. And then the other one was the director of the appropriations committee for that $1 trillion. And so here you've got the person that's writing the legislation and the person, or she's not actually writing it, but she's the one that's in charge of getting that team together, and then the one that's appropriating the funds from that thing. One of the two had not heard of glyphosate before, and neither of them understood that glyphosate had any direct effects on human cells. And so here's the two women in the United States that could instantly change the situation. And I had been under the impression that, Bayer and Monsanto and all these lobbyists had been in there, poisoning their minds. Nobody had come in. There's just no information available to the people that could change these things. That gets me pretty excited that
Wow.
governments can change in an instant if we give them the
Mm.
right data sets. Governments thrive under a productive society, and you wouldn't
Mm.
know that in our current Western economy because we're so reliant on disease. And so this gets at the macro version of the problem we were talking about earlier. You mentioned that situation where your dad was getting so much positive feedback for having an identity of disease, right? And so there
Yeah.
was the empathy, and then you mentioned an important one. There was actually insurance benefits that were being
Hmm.
won. So he gets the monthly check and the things there. So he needed to stay diseased to have the money. Our entire country of the United States is now in that situation.
Yeah.
Our entire GDP, $17 trillion, relies on $5 trillion
Hmm.
from the healthcare industry and another $1 trillion from direct consumer spending into the health and wellness space. And so 6 trillion of a $17 trillion economy relies on disease.
Mm.
And so our country now has an identity and an economy built around that identity that it is disincentivizing us from actually getting healthy. And so this is subconscious, again, for a country as it is for the individual. Of like, it feels like you're doing the right thing by going to the doctor and getting your pills. And,
Mm.
you feel so good when you come home from the pharmacy and you did manage after 3 hours of line to finally get that little orange bottle from the pharmacy. And you're like, well, this is my health in a bottle. This whole country is taking the health in the bottle approach now. And for that, we are collapsing our productivity, just as your dad saw in his life.
Yeah.
And what we must do is, so as we strip away our real identity and start to layer on these disease identities, productivity is going to fall, creativity is going to fall. And increasing is the mental health instability and the depressiveness and the failure of creativity in there. And that's the United States as a whole now.
Yeah. And there's ways we can remedy that, and many people are doing it on an individual level. And I think that a groundswell of people doing it will and can create change. I think a system as a whole, if you think about it, we are living within fractals of an entire universe. And then from the smallest cell, even to a quasi particle or a subatomic particle to a cell, there's just these whole systems within a system. You look at the Earth as a system too, and as it diseases, it will self heal. It's my belief, at least, and it will learn and it'll grow. Um, One of the things I wanted to touch on was that I think it's funny that, like, I've always thought about like big pharma, big ag. big this. Now I've got another problem. There's big gluten free now. So that's a new one
Yeah.
for me after your experience. That's pretty mind blowing. I didn't know that existed.
Yeah, and there's
Um,
big supplement, and so
yeah,
the probiotic industry is $47 billion, and we've known since 2018. I mean, we knew before this, but
yeah,
our top peer-reviewed, science, periodicals in the country started publishing in 2018 that probiotics were suppressing the microbiome diversity just as potently as antibiotics were. And so
jeez.
that was September of 2018. Three major studies got published at the same time, and it
Yeah,
was so damning to probiotics. We should have immediately stopped the probiotic industry,
yeah.
and yet it's doubled in size since 2018. And so
Phew.
$47 billion just for probiotics, you start to realize again,
Yeah.
this disease identity drives so much
Mm,
economy that losing the concept of the disease is the last thing that the Fed or somebody concerned about the US dollar wants. And so
mm.
it's a really insidious thing that even these altruistic, parts of our economies, functional medicine or
Yeah,
the functional medicine industry is just like the allopathic medicine. It relies on your disease.
yeah.
And this is one of the reasons I finally had to close my clinic is I needed to find a way to engage the public in which they would want to engage with me when they were healthy. And if they did have disease, they were in it to find that health to make the clinic obsolete. But if I
Mm,
was still running a clinic and I was relying on an economy driven by disease, then there's this subconscious, feedback loop. Well, why don't you come back in 3 months and we'll check again? Well, if I really believed that they could heal themselves and they were a healing machine, why book the 3 month return? And
yeah.
so there's just this insidious trap that we get into,
Mm,
even as well-meaning doctors and the rest. We can be part of that codependence in this subtle, subconscious way. And the more altruistic it looks, the more likely it's going to be hard to identify.
yeah, it's very fascinating. And it's for sure an issue that needs rectifying. So I have maybe two questions in one here. If gluten's not the issue, then what are the top five? Well, on its own, right? So on its own, but what are the top sort of five food groups that have the most glyphosate in them? Then that's probably the question to ask, or five or ten. Like, what are the most common glyphosate contributing foods to the modern diet that people could immediately go, okay, I want to like eliminate those? And then the second part of the question is, what are the most natural gut supportive foods that you find are most accretive to health, or some of the foods that you eat on a daily basis that you, as Zach Bush in your evolving wisdom, now turn to as your staples?
Yeah, so the ones that are most toxic differ a little bit as to where you're at and what season it is. And so the Environmental Working Group has a very active, wonderful resource for everybody. It's called the Clean 15 and the Dirty Dozen. And so
Mm,
the Dirty Dozen are those that are so toxic that you either are going to get that from your own backyard where you know where it's being grown, or you get it from the best organic supply you got, or you just don't eat it.
yeah.
Top of that list is pretty unchangeable. Strawberries are always number one. Strawberries anywhere in the world, even if it says organic on it, I don't believe it. The amount of antifungals and everything else, organic or otherwise, that are used to grow a strawberry in that environment where you're going to pick it before it's ready and then ship it somewhere distant to be consumed. There's a whole setup for disaster there. So strawberries, probably just stop eating. That's the easiest rule. Number two behind that is typically apples. And so apples have become extremely chemical intensive. And then behind that would be some of the citrus and things like that. But I would say to tap in and start to kind of memorize at least those top five of the dirty dozen
Mm.
and have a sense of what that looks like for your
I think
environment.
also like celery and blueberries and spinach are often quite high up the list
Kale,
on the
kale,
dirty dozen. Kale, yeah.
Brussels sprouts, like some of the best things.
Mm.
And so if you're gonna, it doesn't mean you can't eat, some of these important things. Brussels sprouts being one of my favorite ones out there, but I did a lot of damage with Brussels sprouts before I found out in my clinic
Mm.
that they were carrying so much glyphosate. And
So
so
has to
Brussels
be
sprouts
organic.
gotta be organic.
Has
Yeah,
to be organic. So all of these foods you just mentioned has to be organic at the least, and
yeah,
ideally know where it's from and
yeah.
get it closer to source so it doesn't travel as far.
But one of the issues that I'm so glad you asked the question, well, what should we eat then? Because we spend too much time saying what we shouldn't do. And I think that
Mm.
this is where the vegan industry kind of collapsed health and inadvertently, is that telling people just not to eat meat is not helpful. It then sets you up for a situation where, well, as long as I'm eating processed soy, I'm a good vegan, and I've been told that vegan extends health, prevents cancer, all kinds of
Mm.
things, and all of that is true. John Robbins and all of his contemporaries coming out of the 70s proved that we could eliminate chronic
Yep.
disease with a plant-based diet. The thing that started my clinic was a plant-based diet clinic, and it was Gabe Merkin out of the 70s, and then Esselstyn out of Cleveland Clinic, and
Yep.
then Cornell with its university-based program there. And so 40 years of good clinical science out of some of the best universities in the world proved that plant-based diets were working. And I launched that in 2010. And by 2012, I was convinced that the science was wrong. What I found out, a year later after starting my own biotech laboratory in that clinic was, oh my gosh, it's the glyphosate that's been added to those foods that's now making this science not work. So
Mm.
food still worked, but the way in which we're growing it now had radically undermined that reality. And so the vegan of the 1980s is not the vegan of 2015 or 2025 here. So in the same way, the meat industry has become more and more increasingly toxic and has less and less nutrient density available in those meats as we went into higher and higher intensity feeding systems for
Yep.
processed, genetically modified feed inputs to the poultry, to the pigs, and to the cattle. And so this decrement in health in the animals is leading to the fact that a paleo diet on Tyson chicken is going to freaking kill you.
Yeah.
You've got so many, drug-resistant bacteria for one thing that are all over that chicken and everything else. Like you're eating a nuclear bomb to the microbiome, whether it be that highly processed meat that's raised in these stressed-out environments. 1/3 of the flock of the American chickens are dead by the time they're 6 weeks old from
Jeez.
invasive E. coli, salmonella, and like 1/3 of our flock. And that flock, my numbers should be pretty close. I think there's seven. The number's actually larger than that, but there's 100 million cows in North America at any given moment growing for our food system, and it's 7 times more per pound of chickens versus cows. So you can imagine how many hundreds of chickens to make up, the meat in a single cow, and then
Mm.
multiply that by 7. So the amount of animals being grown in this country is just staggering. And then to
Mm.
find out that 1/3 are dead before they're 6 weeks old from the noxious environments they're born into. Failure of their immune systems is fundamentally across the entire flock. The amount of stress in those organisms is immeasurable at that point. And
Yeah.
that's your chicken salad the next day. So 2/3 of the flock that survives that first 6 weeks is on such high levels of antibiotic to try to help them survive that they have absolutely no gut microbiome. And so that meat is so deprived of nutrients. The chickens are just pale ghosts. They have no coloration in their feet. They have no coloration in their beaks. Their cartilage never in their body actually forms into bone, so they're floppy. They have no muscle tone. They live out their lives in these closed cages where they can't even turn around, and they're being shat on by the chicken above them. I mean, it is just a horror
Mm.
show. And then you think, wow, what's the ramifications of eating that genetically? What's the epigenetic
Yeah.
damage to that animal? And
What's
then
the
what's
energetic
right?
damage?
And so you just
Yeah.
have these levels. You got toxins, epigenetic stress, and then energetic stress.
Yeah.
You can't believe that humans are even surviving for a moment in this toxic food environment we've created. And I guess
Yeah.
the answer is we're really not. This is the extinction process we're in.
So when you eat on a day-to-day basis, you're eating organic, you're less concerned with things like gluten and that now. And like, what are things that you do on a frequent basis in terms of your food rituals to support health?
So glad because I didn't come back to that. So Clean 15 was the other side of the EWG.
Yeah.
The top 5 in there. The nice thing about the Clean 15 is it doesn't matter if it's organic or conventional or however it's grown, it's clean. So there's
Uh-huh.
just some crops that simply don't need chemical inputs.
Yeah.
And if chemical inputs are used, they don't end up in the food. And
Mm.
so a great example of this is the avocado. Avocados do not carry pesticides. So they're typically number 1 on the cleanest foods on the planet are avocados, which is such a relief because I eat those as a main food group.
Yeah.
So avocados, and then my second biggest intake, especially when I'm home, I cook every single day with it, red cabbage. Red cabbage is freaking miraculous. It's super low in herbicides, pesticides for reasons that people don't even understand what the red cabbage is doing to transmute toxins. But it transmutes toxins into my body. I know after 7 weeks of travel internationally, I can get home and eat my red cabbage meal that I could prep at home for 3 or 4 days, and it is the best detox on the planet. So red
Wow.
cabbage, and then behind that, sweet potatoes. So those three are actually really clean, both conventional and organically grown. And those are the three that you can just eat worldwide all of the time: red cabbage, avocado, and a sweet potato, and you're pretty golden. I do like adding Brussels sprouts to that pattern, because if you get a sweet potato and a Brussels sprout that's grown organically, I mean, you've really got every single, not only nutrient, macro, micronutrient, because the skin of the sweet potato has got every mineral on the periodic chart. You also have the medicines within the food within those two. So the alkaloids are very high within the sweet potato and the Brussels sprout there, and the sweet potato is carrying the starch. And the starch is a big secret to gut microbiome.
Mm.
Um, we're afraid of starchy foods. Oh, everything white's bad for you, all that stuff. No, starch is phenomenal. I think it's McDougall that wrote the starch book, right? So, there's a great book on the secret of starch as your kind of health rebuilding thing for chronic pain, chronic fatigue, all this stuff. So starch is a magic thing when it's grown well, and sweet potatoes are an easy way to get that. So sweet potatoes and Brussels sprouts, it makes a whole meal in and of itself. You've got more protein per calorie in a Brussels sprout than you do in a steak. It's just an insane amount of protein resources, mineral resources, nutrient resources. So those are some of the magic ones out there, but I can't overemphasize the red cabbage, because you're going to remember all the other ones. You're going to forget the red cabbage. So get that red cabbage into your diet. And then the other thing that I need to recommend is just get more herbs on your plate. We so undervalue herbs. We've forgotten what it tastes like to have fresh herbs in your diet. But if you've got coriander, or often called cilantro, in your diet on a regular basis, combine that with parsley. So my favorite dish right behind my red cabbage one is what I call a summer pesto. Summer pesto has a little bit of basil in it, but it's actually mostly like a flat Italian parsley, and cilantro, a tiny bit of cilantro in there to give it a backbone. And then pine nuts are great, but you can also just use an avocado in there. And a magic ingredient in there is actually an organic broccoli. So organic broccoli,
Mm.
floret within your pesto gives a whole nother dimension to the pesto. It'll be the best pesto your friends have ever eaten. So get this combination of herbs and fats into a pasta or whatever you're doing. I don't eat gluten free. I eat gluten quite regularly in my life, and I'm always going after those organic gluten sources, especially the ones that are fermented. And so a
Mm.
sourdough has an
Mm.
incredibly wonderful, friendly relationship to the gut microbiome. And my patients that would leave the United States with severe gluten sensitivity would experience this. They'd go eat croissants on the streets of Paris and with absolutely no ramifications. And they'd
Yeah.
come back so excited. I think my gluten sensitivity is gone. And then they would come and eat a single bun on something in the United States, and it'd take them a week to recover from the brain fog with the amount of glyphosate. And so eat clean, because
Mm.
again, that croissant is not just the wheat, it's that ancient technology of butter with the wheat. And so
Mm.
that fat with the carbohydrate completely changes its dynamics as it goes through the gut. And so all the things we were taught were bad are getting good again, right? So butter was causing heart disease and everything else. Now we find out if you just add some butter to the damn wheat, you're going to end up with a croissant, and not death. So there's just this exciting revolution and renaissance going, I think, of whole foods and real artisan foods. The amount of sourdough bread that was baked during the pandemic is probably
Yeah.
more than the entire history of mankind. I mean,
Yeah.
everybody suddenly was like, I'm bored, I'm at home, I'm going to try this sourdough thing. I mean, it just went berserk worldwide, and it made me so happy. It was just the most unexpected cure to our dedication to the gluten sensitivity, was just lock people up and tell them they can't go anywhere for a while, and they're going to get so bored with Netflix in 5 days they're going to have to start making sourdough, and they're going to find out they're not gluten sensitive.
There's a saying from one of my main spiritual teachers, and I remember it by using my fingers. It is, everything is absolutely always unfolding perfectly.
Yeah.
And it helps us to see that the biggest challenges are the most beautiful perfections that can open up, incredible opportunities. And yeah, I think that's a great way to finish this chat, Zach. You're such a great philosopher and harbinger of information that is really important for the world. And so grateful to support your story and your message. And I think it's such a Buddhist path, what you're teaching here. It's a
Mhm.
middle path. It's not extreme. It's like, hey, these toxins are not natural and not good. And let's not vilify food groups that are not inherently bad. Let's take a middle path and let's connect more with nature. It's beautiful. And all the power to you. And thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thrilled to be with you.
What a masterclass. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. I particularly love, like I mentioned at the beginning, his talk about disease identities. Sometimes we get so attached to this identity of disease. And this is an incredible sort of wake up call for us to move towards an identity of wellness and wholeness and well being. So thank you, Zach, for your contribution. And like I mentioned earlier, if you love learning about nutrition, healing the gut, taking control of your health, and really, in a way, reducing your reliance on the medical industry and the big food industry and the big agricultural industry, then studying nutrition might be your next best step. It certainly was for myself and for Laurentine. We have our Food Matters and Nutrition course open for enrollment. Within 12 weeks, you can become certified and be practicing or just helping yourself and your family get well with a deeper understanding of this knowledge. The program has 100% money back guarantee. You can learn in audio and video, and the accreditation is recognized in 35 different countries where you can receive insurance as well around the world. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I can't wait to hear what you thought of this masterclass. Have a beautiful day.